Today's ship chat is at the request of Commander Philip Ty. If you join at the Commander tier, then you'll be able to make requests for video topics. Thank you very much. Today we're looking at the Challenger class. There's not a whole lot to really say about it, although I will point out that I take some exception to the use of the title, given that in current day, when most people think of the Challenger, they think of the Challenger battle tank, which is a very good bit of kit, and I rather resent that this name is then used on what is quite a, by all standards, a very mediocre starship. So, well, in any case, we'll get into it and why it is quite a mediocre starship. So, like the rest of the Wolf 359 designs, it was built by Ed Meriaki and Mike Okuda using a variety of kit-bashed parts. This is an interesting kit bash. It uses Galaxy-class parts, but it actually uses two different scales of Galaxy-class parts, which is quite unusual. It's what really gives it its very odd, distinctive shape. So it doesn't use the same saucer section as the Niagara or Challenger, which use a custom-built saucer. This uses a Galaxy-class saucer, but it is a smaller scale than the nacelles, and that's why it's not quite so big. You can actually see an illustration here of a Challenger with the correctly scaled nacelles and saucer. And it has a very different appearance. I'm not sure if I like it more, but it certainly is very different. It reminds me a lot of the Kelvin, that kind of saucer-heavy profile. And saying that, I actually don't mind the Kelvin. But in any case, it's a pretty basic design otherwise. It also incorporates a conning tower from a Typhoon-class submarine. That's what makes up the dorsal pylon. The rest of the superstructure is custom made, but there really isn't much of it. It's also worth mentioning that what you see in the Wolf 359 sequence, well, for starters, it's very badly beaten and worn. It's a very good looking hulk, actually. It's got real chunks cut out of it. It's quite a good looking job that they did. But it was then rebuilt and retextured for the official Starships collection, which is in some respects very different. They add a different shuttle bay, they widen the sort of rear hull, make everything flush, and flow together much better. But it is somewhat different from the original Wolf 359 design. So that really brings us to its in-universe story. Obviously, it's one of the Brahms designs, and it makes use of the large Galaxy-class nacelles. Now, the actual configuration of the nacelles, this vertical configuration, is more for economy than performance. If your warp field is roughly around the center of mass of your design, and as low profile as possible, that you minimize fuel consumption. Now, this also means that you do not gain any particular advantage in speed or acceleration. It's just a basic level warp field, but it is the most fuel efficient. You'll see that's why the Romulans also make use of a similar design a lot of the time, generating a warp field at the ship's center of mass. Unlike most of the other Brahms ships, this isn't really intended for performance. It never was. Another point I should also observe that because of this vertical nacelle design, there's not much actual depth to the hull, and what this means is that they have to mount the warp core horizontally in order to fit it in. Otherwise, it would be too tall for the ship. Remember, this still needs to mount a Galaxy-class warp core, which is not an insubstantial bit of equipment. Aside from that, though, not only does it, of course, mount Galaxy-class nacelles and a Galaxy-class warp core, it, of course, also has Galaxy-class facilities. And this really comes down to the job of the Challenger. Unlike the more frontline ships, like the Galaxy and the Nebula, which are going out there and doing exploring, or the third echelon ships, or the rear echelon ships, like the Freedom, which are kind of doing, technical, busy work. the Challenger is actually a diplomatic vessel. It's essentially a diplomatic intermediary. It's, not quite as important and as powerful as the top of the line ships, but it's still a very respectable ship and is the primary ship for most diplomatic assignments. And that's including, of course, being a diplomatic courier, ferrying dignitaries about. It can also quite easily host conferences on board. Remember, this is built using the same, slightly scaled down, but essentially a Galaxy-class saucer. It has all the facilities you could possibly need for most diplomatic occasions. And given the amount of, you've got to think that, particularly during the 24th century, not only is this doing external diplomacy, and there are a lot of, and, people obviously think when it comes to diplomacy, they think a lot about the major powers, and that often does involve the larger first-rate ships. But in the 24th century, there are almost just as many, if not more, independent powers or neutral planets, all of which require the establishing and maintaining of diplomatic relations, which is very important. That's not even including the myriad diplomatic relationships internal to the Federation that need to be maintained. So that is really what the job of the Challenger is to maintain those consistent relationships, the stuff that kind of just goes on in the background, and maintaining that diplomatic presence and profile of the Federation. That is really the job of the Challenger. Yes, it is capable, obviously, of science and exploration and combat, diplomatic relations, politics. That is its task. That is really what it is meant to do. And that also explains why it has most of its performance in every other respect are very mediocre. Now, obviously I mentioned the lackluster warp performance, and I should also mention that in combat it is powerful, because it is based, again, on the Brahms design. It has a lot of power to it. But it is probably the weakest or the most mediocre of all the Brahms designs. It lacks strong firing arcs. It has a very basic setup, one fore, one aft torpedo launcher, and 2 phaser arrays. If you are small enough and you can position yourself well enough, you can actually get into phaser blind spots behind it. It really doesn't have any particularly strong arcs of fire. The weapons here are very defensive. Now, that being said, they're still very powerful. In fact, Admiral Nechayev very much wanted to get these into the Cardassian border war, because, you compare this to its Cardassian contemporaries, and you can immediately see the advantage. But Starfleet specifically would not release the Brahms ships for the border war, and this was a very deliberate decision, because as far as they were concerned, these new ships were ships of peace and exploration, the culmination of the Golden Age. And so they didn't want them to be seen going into combat. So we don't actually see much of it in terms of its combat performance until the Battle of Wolf 359, and it's not like you can really gauge much from that, other than it doesn't take well to lasers and tractor beams. What ship did, but we would then see it in combat quite commonly in the Dominion War. Again, it's not, anything spectacular. It's not leading the charge by any means. It's one of the standard line cruisers, and you can see it there next to Excelsior and Ambassador, the other sort of mainline cruisers, just, holding the line physically most of the time. And that was really what its Dominion War performance was. It was there at most of the major engagements, but it never really distinguished itself, and oftentimes there were problems found. It was very vulnerable in more open engagements. It was found to be very vulnerable to flanking attacks. As a result, was quite a mediocre cruiser in the end of the war, but I suppose that when you needed a cruiser, having just another cruiser was perfectly acceptable. And then post-war, it began to really fall out of favour. And there was a really twofold explanation for this. One, it's lackluster or mediocre wartime performance. When the Federation is now concerned with, ensuring its own security, a completely dedicated diplomatic vessel is kind of regarded as unnecessary or insufficient. That's one aspect of it. By this point in the 2380s, Starfleet, for its diplomatic tasks, are entrusting them to the high-end, high-performance, particularly if it's an external assignment, if they're establishing, if they're engaging in talks with another major power, then they will use ships like the Sovereign and the Lunar class. These more combat-effective starships that are top of the line, have plenty of luxury and have all the provisions for diplomatic conferences, but they are also very well armed. And that is a very deliberate statement on the part of Starfleet. It is saying to them, depending on who they're negotiating with, we are capable of defending ourselves, don't push us. Or, if you're talking with an ally, it's like, you can trust us, we'll back you up, we've got the equipment. And the Challenger didn't really do any of that. It didn't really reassure anyone. And after the Federation has been through quite a traumatic conflict, its allies and its enemies need to see something like that. The Challenger no longer really can do its job effectively. People don't really, as a symbol, as a statement, it's out of time. It's out of time, out of place. It does not conform to the reality that people have come to understand. And aside from that, it looks like a bloody lollipop, which isn't perhaps the most becoming or elegant or as most authoritative appearance that a ship can have. So there we really have it. That's the Challenger class for you.